In 334 BC, a 20-year-old king stepped onto the stage of history and refused to play a small role. Alexander the Great, ruler of a rugged northern kingdom, launched a daring campaign against the mightiest empire on earth, the Persian Empire. What followed wasn't just war, it was a storm. Battle after battle, Alexander's bold tactics and fearless leadership shattered armies far larger than his own. In just 10 years, he marched farther than any Greek before him, across deserts, over mountains, and into lands many believed marked the edge of the world. By the time he stopped, he had forged one of the largest empires in history. To his enemies, he was a destroyer, Alexander the Accursed. To the world that remembered him, he became something else entirely: Alexander the Great. But his story begins long before his first victory. Welcome to ancient Greece, a fractured land of brilliance and bloodshed. From around 500 BC, this rocky peninsula became the birthplace of revolutionary ideas in art, philosophy, and warfare. Two powers rose above the rest: Athens, a hub of democracy and culture, and Sparta, a society built for war. In 480 BC, these rivals faced a common enemy: the invading Persian Empire. At the narrow pass of Battle of Thermopylae, 300 Spartans and their allies made a legendary last stand, holding back a massive Persian army for 3 days before being surrounded and slain. Then came revenge. At the Battle of Salamis, the Greek fleet crushed the Persian navy in a stunning victory, and a year later, at Battle of Plataea, Greek forces delivered the final blow, driving the invaders out for good. What followed was a golden age, but not for long. Rivalries reignited. Athens and Sparta turned on each other, dragging the Greek world into decades of brutal conflict. War after war drained their strength, leaving them fractured and exposed. From the north, a new power was rising. For generations, the Greeks had mocked Macedonia as a backward land. But under one man, everything changed: Philip II of Macedon. A master strategist, Philip transformed his army into a killing machine. His greatest innovation? The sarissa, a terrifying 18-foot pike, twice the length of a standard spear. In tight formation, his soldiers formed an unstoppable wall of spikes known as the phalanx. In 338 BC, at the Battle of Chaeronea, Philip crushed the combined forces of Athens and Thebes. Greece had fallen. Through conquest and diplomacy, he united the Greek city-states into a single alliance, the League of Corinth. For the first time, Greece stood together, under one ruler. Philip had a vision: a massive, united Greek invasion of Persia. Revenge, glory, wealth beyond imagination. But just as the campaign was about to begin, everything changed. Philip was assassinated, killed by his own bodyguard in a shocking act of betrayal. The throne passed to his son, young, unproven, surrounded by enemies. But this was no ordinary prince. This was Alexander. In 343 BC, King Philip II sought a tutor capable of preparing his son for the unique burden of Macedonian kingship. He chose a then obscure philosopher named Aristotle, whose father had served as the court physician to the Macedonian royalty. Alexander lived and studied alongside a select group of noble peers known as the Royal Pages. This group included his future general Ptolemy and his closest companion Hephaestion, creating a generation of Macedonians destined to transform the ancient world. Aristotle's pedagogy was rooted in empirical observation and the systematic categorization of the natural world, a radical departure from the abstract theories of earlier Greek thought. For 3 years, beneath the shaded limestone porticos, he tutored the prince in a broad curriculum that spanned ethics, politics, rhetoric, geometry, and astronomy. One of the most enduring influences was in the practice of the art of medicine. Aristotle, having a medical background, imparted a practical interest in healing. Throughout his later campaigns, Alexander would personally prescribe diets and medicinal treatments for his sick friends. This scientific foundation also motivated Alexander to take an army of botanists and zoologists with him into Asia to collect specimens and document new species for study back in Greece. While Aristotle sharpened Alexander's intellect, he also provided the spiritual manual for his conquests by gifting him an annotated copy of Homer's Iliad. Alexander regarded the epic not merely as fiction, but as a handbook of the art of war and a perfect portable treasure of all military virtue. He identified so deeply with the hero Achilles, whom his mother Olympias claimed as a direct ancestor, that he sought to frame his future invasion of Asia as a modern Trojan War. This spiritual bond was so intense that Alexander reportedly slept with the Iliad and a dagger under his pillow, viewing the hero's quest for invincible glory as his personal destiny. This education pushed Alexander toward a path of self-restraint and honor, which stood in stark contrast to the often chaotic model set by his father. The physical instrument of Alexander's ambition was the professional standing army developed by Philip II. At its core was the Macedonian phalanx, a revolutionary unit organized 16 ranks deep. These soldiers were armed with the sarissa, a massive 18-foot pike twice the length of the standard Greek spear. This dense wall of iron spear tips made the formation virtually unstoppable from the front, though it was difficult to maneuver and highly vulnerable on the flanks. To solve this, Alexander utilized 3,000 elite hypaspists, specialized shield bearers with shorter spears, to guard the sides of the phalanx. For disrupting enemy lines, he employed the Agrianes, elite javelin throwers from the mountains of Thrace, while the companion cavalry, 1,800 elite horsemen, served as the army's primary hammer for delivering the decisive blow. In the spring of 334 BC, Alexander crossed the Hellespont into Asia Minor with roughly 40,000 men. His first major test came at the river Granicus. The Persian army, positioned behind the 60-foot wide river with its steep, slippery banks, waited for the Macedonians to struggle through the shallow water. Refusing to wait for dawn, Alexander led his right wing directly into the current, charging into a hail of Persian javelins and arrows. The fighting in the riverbed was a blood rage melee, where men and horses were jammed together, the Macedonians striving to climb the muddy banks, while the Persians fought to push them back into the water. During the peak of the struggle, Alexander was recognized by his royal armor and targeted by the Persian nobility. One noble, Rhoesaces, struck Alexander on the head with a sword, breaking a piece of his helmet. As Alexander drove his lance into Rhoesaces, a second noble, Spithridates, raised his sword to deliver a fatal strike to the king's exposed head. At that exact moment, Clytus the Black, a veteran commander of the companion cavalry, lunged forward and severed Spithridates' arm mid-swing, saving Alexander's life. This narrow survival allowed the Macedonian phalanx to finally gain the shore, crushing the Persian defense and opening the gates of Asia Minor. By 332 BC, Alexander faced his most daunting strategic obstacle, the island city of Tyre. Located 1 kilometer off the coast of modern-day Lebanon, Tyre was a maritime fortress protected by massive walls that rose 150 feet directly from the Mediterranean. For a general whose success relied on the hammer and anvil, fixing the enemy with infantry and striking with cavalry, Tyre was a nightmare. His horsemen were useless against sea walls, and his phalanx had nowhere to march. Alexander initially attempted a peaceful resolution, but after the Tyrians executed his heralds, he resolved to neutralize the Persian fleet on land by capturing their last major naval base. To reach the city, Alexander's engineers began an unprecedented feat of civil engineering, the construction of a massive causeway, or mole, to bridge the gap between the mainland and the island. The workers harvested stone and rubble from the ruins of Old Tyre on the mainland and utilized timber from the nearby Lebanese forests. While the work progressed quickly in the shallow water, where the depth was only about 4.5 feet, it slowed to a crawl as they reached a steep drop-off, where the water plummeted to 18.5 feet. Under constant harassment from Tyrian archers and catapults on the walls, Alexander's soldiers constructed a protective palisade and moved 2 massive timber siege towers to the end of the causeway. These siege towers were arguably the tallest ever built in antiquity, reaching a height of nearly 50 meters, 164 feet. They functioned as mobile artillery platforms with torsion catapults on the top levels to clear defenders and ballistae on the lower levels to hurl stones at the walls and ships. To protect the wood from fire arrows, the engineers draped the structures in rawhide. However, the Tyrians launched a devastating counter-offensive using a modified horse transport ship filled with pitch, sulfur, and dried branches. They hung cauldrons of oil from the masts and weighted the back of the ship so the prow would rise over the causeway. When the fire ship struck, the oil cauldrons collapsed, engulfing the Macedonian towers in a localized firestorm that destroyed months of engineering work. Alexander's response was a masterclass in adaptation. He realized the siege would fail without naval superiority and assembled a fleet of approximately 220 ships from Cyprus, Rhodes, and other Phoenician cities. His siege train experts, known as catapeltafetae, began mounting battering rams and torsion projectors directly onto the decks of transport galleys. When Tyrian divers swam out to cut the anchor cables of these ships, the Macedonians replaced the ropes with iron chains, a first in naval siege warfare. They also used crane ships to haul large underwater stones away from the city walls to allow the rams to get in range. After 7 months of relentless engineering and naval blockade, Alexander's shipborne rams finally breached the southern wall, leading to a brutal massacre that saw 8,000 Tyrians killed and 30,000 sold into slavery. In the spring of 333 BC, Alexander reached Gordium, the ancient capital of Phrygia. Here sat the chariot of King Midas, fastened to a pole with a knot of cornel tree bark so intricate that no one could find the ends. A prophecy claimed that whoever untied the knot would become the Lord of Asia. While the most popular legend depicts Alexander slicing the knot with his sword, a more technically plausible version comes from the eyewitness Aristobulus. According to this account, Alexander realized the knot was secured by a wooden pin, or hestor, that ran through the yoke and the pole. Instead of using brute force, he simply pulled the pin out, allowing the yoke to slide off and the knot to unravel from within. A solution of mechanical insight rather than impulsive violence. By late 332 BC, following the grueling sieges of Tyre and Gaza, Alexander marched toward Egypt, the breadbasket of the Mediterranean. The Persian governor, Mazaces, recognizing that he lacked the troops to resist the Macedonian war machine, surrendered the city of Pelusium and the entire royal treasury without a fight. Alexander's entry into Memphis was not a conquest, but a coronation. To the Egyptians, he was not a foreign occupier, but a liberator from Persian rule. In the ancient capital of Memphis, the high priests crowned him Pharaoh, a title that bestowed upon him the status of a living god and the legitimate successor to the 3,000-year-old line of Egyptian kings. At the mouth of the Nile, Alexander performed a task of urban engineering that would outlast his empire: the founding of Alexandria. He personally walked the site, using flour to mark the outlines of the city's walls, its agora, and its temples. Following this, he embarked on a perilous 300-mile journey through the Sahara to the Siwa oasis to consult the oracle of Amun. According to historical accounts, the priests greeted him as the son of Amun, effectively confirming his divine status in the eyes of his subjects. This pilgrimage was a strategic masterstroke. By aligning himself with the supreme deity of the Egyptian pantheon, whom the Greeks identified with Zeus, Alexander transformed his political authority into a religious mandate that justified his continued march into the heart of Persia. In October 331 BC, Alexander marched into the heart of Mesopotamia for a final showdown with Darius III. Darius had chosen the battlefield of Gaugamela specifically for its flat, open terrain, which favored his superior numbers and his most feared weapon: 200 scythed chariots. The Persians had even spent weeks leveling the ground and removing obstacles to ensure the chariots could reach maximum velocity. Estimates placed the Persian army between 50,000 and 80,000 strong, outnumbering the Macedonians nearly 2-1, and featuring diverse contingents, including Indian cavalry and war elephants. Alexander deployed his army in an unusual formation, with the wings angled back to prevent the Persians from encircling his smaller force. As the battle began, Alexander led his right wing in a striking, diagonal move across the field. This forced the Persians to shift their own lines to keep up, inadvertently creating gaps in their center. Darius unleashed his scythed chariots to break the Macedonian lines, but Alexander's specialized Agrianes javelin throwers picked off the drivers before they could impact. For the chariots that made it through, the Macedonian infantry performed a lane maneuver, simply opening their ranks to let the chariots pass harmlessly into the rear, where they were easily neutralized. Seeing the Persian center weaken as they shifted to mirror his movement, Alexander immediately formed his companion cavalry into a massive wedge and charged directly at Darius. The ferocity of this shock assault caused the Persian center to collapse, and Darius, fearing capture, fled the field in his chariot. However, the victory was nearly snatched away. On the left wing, the veteran general Parmenion was being completely surrounded by thousands of Persian and Indian horsemen. Alexander was forced to abandon his pursuit of Darius to ride back and save his own left wing. By the time the dust settled, the Persian army had been routed, the road to Babylon was open, and Alexander was recognized as the new rightful ruler of the East. In 329 BC, Alexander led an army of approximately 100,000 troops and followers into one of the most hostile environments on Earth, the Hindu Kush mountain range. Known to the Greeks as the Indian Caucasus, these peaks form a 15,000-foot-high wall of rock and ice separating the Iranian plateau from the Indian subcontinent. To maintain a rapid pace, Alexander enforced a strict no carts, no oxen rule, forcing his soldiers to carry their own gear through narrow passes like the Kawak and Kushan. The crossing was a logistical nightmare. Blizzards blinded scouts, and temperatures plunged well below freezing even during the day. When grain supplies failed, the men were forced to slaughter their baggage animals, often eating the meat raw because there was no wood for fires, or boiling leather straps and shoes for sustenance. In 327 BC, Alexander faced the impregnable Sogdian Rock in Central Asia, where local rebels mocked him, saying he would need flying soldiers to take the heights. Alexander called for 300 experienced volunteers who had mastered technical climbing. Using iron tent pegs as pitons, hammered into the crevices and frozen snow, and heavy flaxen ropes, the men began a nighttime ascent of the vertical cliff face. While 30 men fell to their deaths, the remaining 270 reached the summit by dawn and signaled the main army with linen flags. The defenders, seeing men standing above them in the morning light, believed an entire airborne army had bypassed their defenses and surrendered immediately. This event stands as one of the earliest documented uses of technical alpine climbing for military purposes. Alexander's final great mountain challenge was the rock of Aornos, modern Pirsar in Pakistan, a site of deep mythological significance to the Greeks. Legend claimed that even the god hero Heracles had failed to capture this 7,000-foot-high fortress. The Hindu clans of the region provided the toughest opposition the Macedonians had ever faced, with the Greeks being outnumbered as much as 5-1. To reach the summit, Alexander's engineers constructed a massive earthen ramp across a deep ravine to bring their torsion catapults into range, a method similar to the siege of Tyre, but performed at high altitude. When the rock fell, Alexander claimed he had achieved what even a god could not, securing his rear and clearing the final barrier to the Indus Valley. By 330 BC, following the death of Darius III, a fundamental shift occurred in Alexander's public persona. No longer just the King of Macedon or the hegemon of the Greeks, he began to style himself as the legitimate successor to the Achaemenid throne, the King of Asia. This transformation was most visible in his attire. Alexander began incorporating elements of Persian royal dress into his wardrobe, such as the white and purple robe and the Persian sash. While he avoided the most extreme Persian garments, like the upright tiara or the trousers that Macedonians viewed as effeminate, this cultural blending was seen by his veteran soldiers as a betrayal of their austere Macedonian roots. The breaking point for many of his men was the attempted introduction of proskinesis, the Persian ritual of prostration. In the Persian court, this was a traditional act of social respect, ranging from a kiss on the hand to bowing low to the floor, depending on one's rank. To the Persians, it was a mark of acknowledging the king's supreme authority. To the Greeks and Macedonians, however, such an act was strictly reserved for the worship of the gods. By demanding this ritual from his own countrymen, Alexander was essentially signaling a claim to divinity, a move viewed as both blasphemous and a descent into Oriental autocracy. Alexander staged a formal banquet to introduce proskinesis to his inner circle, ensuring that his Persian subjects and a few primed Greek flatterers would lead the way. However, the plan was thwarted by Callisthenes of Olynthus, the official court historian and nephew of Aristotle. Callisthenes spoke out openly against the practice, arguing that honors for humans and gods must be kept distinct. At the climax of the banquet, Callisthenes reportedly omitted the prostration while attempting to kiss the king. When his omission was pointed out by a courtier, Callisthenes famously remarked that he would simply go away poorer by a kiss. While he successfully prevented the ritual from becoming mandatory for the Greeks, his defiance made him a marked man in Alexander's increasingly paranoid court. In late 330 BC, while wintering at Frada in modern-day Afghanistan, the simmering tension between Alexander and the old guard of the Macedonian aristocracy reached a violent climax. The spark was a minor conspiracy led by an obscure soldier named Dimnus, who planned to assassinate the king. Philotas, the commander of the elite companion cavalry and the son of the veteran general Parmenion, was informed of the plot twice, but chose not to report it. When the plot was eventually exposed by another informant, Philotas claimed he had dismissed the rumors as a lover's quarrel and beneath the king's notice. To the increasingly paranoid Alexander, this silence was not a lapse in judgment, it was high treason. Alexander turned the matter over to the Macedonian army, which held capital jurisdiction in such cases. At a formal trial before the troops, Philotas was accused by the New Guard generals, Craterus and Coenus, who sought to dismantle the influence of Parmenian's family. To force a confession, Hephaestion personally oversaw the torture of Philotas throughout the night. Plutarch provides a chilling detail. Alexander was not present in the torture chamber, but stood behind a curtain, listening to the screams of his former friend. Broken by the rack, Philotas eventually confessed that both he and his father believed Alexander's claim to divinity was a scandal that justified regicide. Philotas was subsequently stoned or speared to death by the army. The execution of the son made the murder of the father inevitable. Parmenion was the most respected officer in the army, but at that moment, he was stationed hundreds of miles away in Ecbatana, controlling the royal treasury and the army's primary supply lines. Alexander could not risk the veteran general hearing of his son's death and launching a revolt with the kingdom's wealth. He dispatched an officer named Polydamas on racing dromedary camels to cross the desert via the most direct route possible. Polydamas reached Ecbatana before the news of the trial could arrive and delivered letters to Parmenion's own subordinates, Cleander, Sitalchus, and Menidas. While the old general was reading a letter from his son, his own officers stabbed him to death. No evidence was ever produced that Parmenion was actually part of the plot. His death was a cold-blooded strategic necessity. In 328 BC, during a winter lull in the campaign at Maracanda, modern Samarkand, Alexander held a grand banquet in honor of Dionysus. The atmosphere was heavily influenced by excessive alcohol consumption, a recurring theme in the later stages of the expedition. As the evening progressed, court flatterers began to laud Alexander's achievements, claiming his victories far surpassed those of his father, Philip II, and even elevating his status to that of a god. These comparisons deeply offended the old guard of Macedonian veterans, who remained fiercely loyal to the memory of Philip II and the traditional, less autocratic style of Macedonian kingship. Clitus the Black, the veteran commander who had famously saved Alexander's life at the Battle of the Granicus by severing the arm of a Persian noble, eventually reached his breaking point. He stood up and openly rebuked the flatterers, asserting that Alexander's glory was built upon the blood of Macedonians and the foundational work of his father. Clitus reportedly stretched out his right hand, the same hand that had saved the king, and reminded Alexander that he owed his very life to those he was now disparaging. Enraged by this public defiance and the criticism of his self-mythologizing, Alexander's temper, often described as impulsive and tempestuous, flared into a lethal blood rage. As guards tried to restrain both men, Alexander snatched a spear from one of the sentries and ran Clitus through, killing him instantly. The shock of the deed was immediate. Alexander was reportedly overcome with intense remorse, retiring to his tent for 3 days without food or water, contemplating suicide. This event serves as a pivotal stain on Alexander's reputation, illustrating his transition from a charismatic leader to a paranoid and insecure autocrat who could murder his closest friends for questioning his ego. To fill the void left by Clitus, Alexander promoted Hephaestion to joint commander of the companion cavalry, further centralizing power among his most personal and unquestioning loyalists. In 327 BC, while in Bactria, the internal decay of Alexander's court reached the next generation of the Macedonian elite, the royal pages, Basilikoi Paides. These were the teenage sons of the highest Macedonian nobility, sent to court to serve the king and learn the arts of war and statecraft. The spark for the conspiracy was a personal humiliation. During a royal hunt, a page named Hermolaus killed a wild boar before Alexander could strike it, a breach of royal prerogative. Alexander, in a public display of anger, ordered Hermolaus to be flogged in front of his peers. This act of corporal punishment, deeply insulting to a Macedonian noble, transformed a loyal servant into a revolutionary. Hermolaus organized a group of fellow pages who shared his resentment of Alexander's increasingly autocratic and un-Macedonian behavior. Their plan was simple and lethal. They would wait for a night when they were assigned to guard the king's bedchamber and assassinate him in his sleep. The plot failed only by chance. On the chosen night, Alexander reportedly stayed out at a drinking party until dawn, never returning to his bed. One of the conspirators eventually confessed to a friend, leading to the immediate arrest of the pages. Under torture, the boys initially claimed the plot was entirely their own, but the political atmosphere required a more prominent scapegoat. The investigators' eyes turned to Callisthenes, the official court historian and nephew of Aristotle. While there was no hard evidence linking him to the specific murder plot, Callisthenes was a vocal critic of proskinesis and was immensely popular with the young men at court, who admired his intellectual independence. His rivals, including the future king Ptolemy, exploited this influence, accusing him of encouraging Hermolaus by telling the boy that the way to achieve eternal fame was to kill the most famous man in the world. Alexander, still bitter over Callisthenes' public refusal to prostrate himself, ordered the historian's arrest. The death of Callisthenes remains a point of forensic historiographical debate. Ptolemy and Curtius Rufus record that he was condemned as a traitor and tortured before being hanged. However, Aristobulus and Cares provide a different account, that he was kept in chains and carted about with the army for months, eventually dying of a disease, likely lice or a respiratory infection, brought on by his confinement. Regardless of the cause, the death of Callisthenes marked the definitive end of Alexander's relationship with the intellectual traditions of his youth. The bridge to Aristotle and the Greek philosophical elite was broken, leaving Alexander in what historians call the loneliness of power, surrounded no longer by friends, but by subjects and flatterers. In the spring of 326 BC, Alexander's eastward march reached the banks of the Hydaspes River, the modern Jhelum in Pakistan. Here he faced King Porus, ruler of the Pauravas, who refused to submit and instead assembled a formidable defensive force. The two armies were separated by a fast-flowing river, significantly swollen by seasonal monsoon rains and melting Himalayan snows. Porus's army was anchored by a terrifying centerpiece, a line of 85 to 200 war elephants stationed along the opposite bank to prevent any attempt at a landing. Alexander's cavalry, the decisive arm of his previous victories, could not be used in a direct crossing. Horses would panic and refuse to charge into the scent and sight of the towering beasts. To bypass this wall of ivory and flesh, Alexander executed what historians call one of his tactical masterpieces. He began a campaign of psychological deception, moving his troops up and down the bank with great clamor every night, until Porus became desensitized to the movement and stopped mirroring every maneuver. Under the cover of a violent thunderstorm, Alexander left a portion of his army, including a soldier dressed in royal robes to act as a decoy, in the main camp under the command of Craterus. Meanwhile, Alexander led a strike force of roughly 15,000 men 17 miles upstream to a hidden crossing point. Despite a terrifying crossing through chin-high water and accidentally landing on an island first, the Macedonians reached the opposite bank and established a bridgehead before Porus could react. As the main battle joined, Alexander utilized his superior mobility, using his horse archers to pelt the elephants with arrows and directing his companion cavalry to envelop the Indian flanks. However, the Macedonian phalanx faced a terror unlike anything they had encountered in Persia. The elephants charged into the dense ranks of the infantry, trampling soldiers and using their trunks to hurl men into the air. Ancient accounts describe the battle as the most costly engagement of the campaign, with elephants inflicting horrific casualties on the Greek veterans. The Macedonians eventually countered by using specialized light infantry to hack at the elephants' trunks and feet with axes, causing the panicked animals to turn and trample their own Indian ranks. Though Porus fought with legendary bravery until the end, his army was routed. Impressed by his spirit, Alexander famously asked how he wished to be treated. Porus replied, "Like a king," leading Alexander to reinstate him as a regional satrap.
After the victory at the Hydaspes, Alexander pushed his army deeper into the Punjab, the land of 5 rivers. However, the campaign was soon derailed by a force of nature the Macedonians were entirely unprepared for: the Indian monsoon. Historical sources indicate that Alexander significantly underestimated the severity of the seasonal rains, which were far heavier and more disruptive than anything the Greeks had experienced in the Mediterranean. For 70 consecutive days, the army was forced to march through a relentless downpour. The rain rotted their equipment, turned the roads into impassable quagmires, and caused the 5 mighty rivers of the region to swell with melting Himalayan snow, making every crossing a life-threatening ordeal. As the army reached the Hyphasis River, the modern Beas, the physical exhaustion of the men was compounded by terrifying intelligence from the interior. Rumors spread of the Nanda Empire waiting at the Delhi Gap with a staggering military force. While the Macedonians had struggled against King Porus's 85 to 200 elephants, reports now claimed that King Agramas commanded an army featuring 3,000 war elephants and hundreds of thousands of infantry. To the battle-weary soldiers, many of whom had been away from home for 8 years, the prospect of facing such a force in the unfamiliar, humid climate of the Ganges Valley felt less like a conquest and more like a death sentence. At the banks of the Hyphasis, the discipline of the Macedonian war machine finally fractured into an outright mutiny. The veteran General Coenus, who had recently led the decisive cavalry charge at the Hydaspes, became the voice of the troops. He addressed the king, stating that the men had reached their physical and emotional limit. Their bodies were scarred by years of wounds, and their spirits were broken by the loss of companions to combat and disease. Alexander, deeply offended and his ego bruised by this refusal to march to the edge of the world, withdrew into his tent for 3 days. He refused to see his officers or take food, hoping his isolation would shame the men into submission as it had in the past. However, this time the army stayed firm, forcing the invincible king to finally concede and order the retreat. Following the mutiny at the Hyphasis River, Alexander began a 10-month journey back toward the sea, following the rivers of the Punjab. This was not a peaceful withdrawal. Alexander designed an arduous and dangerous return route that may have been intended to demonstrate that the army's strength remained intact despite their refusal to march further east. The campaign against the Malians, or Malians, in the southern Punjab was particularly brutal. Facing a force that some estimates suggest was largely composed of non-professional tribal fighters, the Macedonian veterans, now totaling only about 15,000 core troops out of a total traveling force of 60,000 to 90,000, engaged in a series of vicious skirmishes. The climax of the Malian campaign occurred during the assault on their capital city. In a moment of extreme frustration with the perceived slowness of his troops during the siege,
Alexander personally seized a ladder and scaled the citadel wall, followed by only 2 or 3 companions. Once at the top, he jumped down alone into the inner courtyard of the enemy fortress, exposing himself to immediate attack. In the frantic close-quarters combat that followed, an enemy archer fired a heavy arrow that struck Alexander in the chest, piercing his lung. When his companions finally breached the walls and reached him, they found the king collapsed and bleeding profusely, his life hanging in the balance. As Alexander was carried away on a shield, word quickly spread throughout the camp that he had died. This news sparked widespread panic and despair among the soldiers, many of whom believed they would never survive the return journey without his leadership. To stabilize the army, Alexander insisted on being shown to his troops as soon as he could be moved. 7 days after being wounded, while still unable to stand, he was placed on a ship and sailed along the riverbank past the assembled army. When he raised his arm to show he was alive, the troops reportedly erupted in cheers, with many veterans weeping in relief at the sight of their surviving commander.
In the autumn of 325 BC, Alexander began his return to the heart of his empire by making a fateful strategic decision, leading his army through the Gedrosian Desert in modern-day southern Pakistan. While this route was a logistical nightmare, Alexander was reportedly driven by an ambition to surpass the legendary figures of the past. Having learned that the great Queen Semiramis and the Persian founder Cyrus the Great had both failed to lead an army through these wastes, Alexander sought to succeed where they had been defeated. However, many historians also view this march as a punishment march, a vengeful reaction to the mutiny at the Hyphasis, intended to remind the troops that they were still subject to the king's iron will, regardless of the environment. The march through Gedrosia became the greatest non-combat catastrophe of the entire campaign. The army faced a lethal combination of extreme heat and a total lack of water. While the core Macedonian soldiers were better prepared, the non-combatant train, consisting of women, children, merchants, and thousands of pack animals, suffered the most. In a cruel irony, many who survived the dehydration were killed by sudden, violent flash floods in the narrow ravines where they camped. As the baggage animals died from exhaustion and heat, the soldiers were forced to slaughter their remaining horses and mules for food, consuming the very transport meant to carry their supplies. At one point, the situation was so dire that Alexander himself left the main column to lead a small party of only 5 men on foot to the coast to search for water and a way out. While the land armies struggled through the sands, Alexander coordinated a parallel journey of maritime exploration. He commissioned his admiral, Nearchus, to lead a fleet from the mouth of the Indus River back to the Persian Gulf. This was one of the most significant voyages of exploration in antiquity, as these waters and the coastline were previously unknown to the Greeks. Nearchus and his crew navigated through the Straits of Hormuz and entered the Persian Gulf, mapping the coast and documenting new tribes and geography. This dual-pronged return was intended to integrate the maritime and land routes of the empire, but it only succeeded at a terrible cost of life. When the remnants of the land army and the fleet finally reunited in Kerman, the once unbeatable Macedonian force was a shadow of its former self. In June 323 BC, Alexander was in Babylon, the city he intended to make the administrative capital of his global empire. He was only 32 years old and was actively planning his next massive undertaking, the invasion of Arabia. The countdown to his death began following a series of long banquets where copious amounts of wine were consumed. According to the royal diaries, or ephemerides, a day-by-day record of the court, Alexander developed a fever following a night of heavy drinking with his companion Medius. Initially, the fever was mild and intermittent, a detail that modern epidemiologists highlight as a critical diagnostic clue. As the days passed, the king's condition moved from exhaustion to total physical collapse. By the fourth night of the illness, the fever had become constant and sustained. Although he initially attempted to continue his royal duties and perform religious sacrifices, he found he could no longer walk and had to be carried to the altar on a litter. Some accounts, though disputed, describe him being stricken with a sudden, sharp pain in his back, as if hit by a spear, followed by severe abdominal agony. By the 7th and 8th days, he was seriously ill, and his mobility had completely vanished, signaling a progressive, symmetrical, and ascending paralysis that moved from his legs to his upper body. By the 10th day, Alexander was extremely ill and had lost the ability to speak, yet historical records from Arrian and Plutarch insist he remained compos mentis, of sound mind and fully alert. When his senior officers entered his chamber, he recognized them, but could offer no words. Rumors of his death began to spread through the city, causing a near riot among the Macedonian veterans. To pacify them, the doors to the royal quarters were opened, and the army was allowed to file past his bed in a single line. Unable to speak, Alexander reportedly greeted his men by raising his head with great difficulty and acknowledging them with his eyes. On the evening of June 10th or 13th, 323 BC, after 12 days of agonizing decline, the invincible king was pronounced dead. The theory of assassination has persisted since antiquity. Specifically, the idea that a drink was spiked during the banquet on the eve of the Arabian invasion. Modern toxicologists have identified white hellebore, Veratrum album, as a primary candidate. This plant contains alkaloids that, when fermented in wine, can induce low blood pressure, a very slow heart rate, and profound muscular weakness, symptoms that align with Alexander's reported condition over his 12-day decline. While many fast-acting poisons were known at the time, hellebore is one of the few that could account for a prolonged, febrile illness rather than an immediate death. Other researchers favor natural causes, pointing to the high prevalence of infectious diseases in ancient Babylon. A 1998 report from the University of Maryland suggested typhoid fever, noting that Alexander's chills, sweats, and exhaustion are hallmarks of the disease. Alternatively, historian Paul Cartledge and others support a diagnosis of malaria. They cite the Ephemerides, royal journals, which record that the king's fever was initially intermittent before becoming constant, a signature fever curve for the Plasmodium falciparum parasite common in the region's marshes. One of the most unique medical hypotheses involves West Nile encephalitis. This theory is based on an incident recorded by Plutarch. As Alexander entered Babylon, a flock of ravens began behaving erratically and died at his feet. This avian omen mirrors modern patterns where bird die-offs precede West Nile outbreaks in humans. While compelling, some experts argue that the West Nile virus may not have evolved to infect humans until centuries after Alexander's death. Finally, some investigators focus on Alexander's lifestyle. The sudden, piercing pain in his back and severe abdominal agony described in some accounts are consistent with acute pancreatitis, likely triggered by years of heavy drinking and the massive intake of alcohol during his final banquets. In this view, his death was the result of a perfect storm of cumulative physical debilitation from past wounds, immense stress, and the toxic effects of alcohol on a compromised system. In the sweltering humidity of a Babylonian June, where a human body would typically begin to liquefy within hours, a phenomenon occurred that redefined Alexander's legend for his followers. According to Plutarch and other ancient sources, Alexander's body lay unattended for 6 full days while his generals argued over the succession, yet it showed no signs of putrefaction. Despite being kept in moist and stifling conditions, the corpse remained pure and fresh.
To the Macedonians, this was the ultimate proof of his divinity, a sign that their king was truly a god, whose physical form was immune to the laws of decay. Modern medical analysis, led by Dr. Catherine Hall of the University of Otago, offers a far more clinical and unsettling explanation. The journals recording Alexander's final days describe a specific pattern. He first lost the ability to walk, then the ability to move his arms, and finally, his voice. This symmetrical ascending paralysis is the hallmark of Guillain-Barré syndrome, GBS, a rare autoimmune disorder likely triggered in Alexander's case by a Campylobacter jejuni infection, which was common in the region. Unlike other febrile illnesses, GBS targets the peripheral nerves, essentially disconnecting the brain from the body's muscles. The most haunting aspect of the GBS theory is the state of the patient's consciousness. GBS often leaves the victim compos mentis, fully aware and of sound mind, even when they are completely immobilized. This matches historical accounts that Alexander recognized his officers and attempted to greet his soldiers with his eyes and slight movements of his head just before being declared dead. If the theory is correct, Alexander may have been trapped in a paralyzed shell, witnessing the mourning of his troops and the political maneuvering of his generals, while unable to speak or move a finger to show he was still alive. The lack of decay was likely not a miracle, but a case of pseudo-thanatos, or a false diagnosis of death. In the 4th century BC, physicians determined death by the presence of breath rather than a pulse. GBS-induced paralysis would have significantly lowered Alexander's demand for oxygen, making his breathing so shallow that it would have been invisible to ancient doctors. Furthermore, a failure of his body's temperature regulation would have made his skin cold, and his pupils would have become fixed and dilated. This evidence suggests that Alexander was medically alive for those 6 days, potentially surviving until the moment the embalmers began their work.
Following his death, Alexander's remains became the most coveted political prize in the ancient world. His body was first hijacked by Ptolemy I and taken to Memphis, then later moved to Alexandria and interred in a grand mausoleum known as the Soma or Sema. Originally, his body was housed in a coffin of hammered gold that was fitted to the body rather than being a simple box. However, around 89 to 90 BC, the unpopular Ptolemy X stripped the gold to finance his wars, replacing it with a sarcophagus made of glass or crystal, likely translucent Egyptian alabaster. For centuries, the tomb served as a site of imperial pilgrimage. Julius Caesar, Augustus, and the obsessed Caracalla all visited the site. Augustus reportedly accidentally broke off the mummified corpse's nose during his inspection, while Caligula is said to have looted the tomb for Alexander's breastplate. The visibility of Alexander's tomb ended abruptly in the late 4th century AD. Between 389 and 391 AD, Emperor Theodosius I issued the Theodosian Decrees, which established Christianity as the only legal religion and authorized the destruction of pagan symbols. As a figure worshipped as a living god, Alexander's tomb became a primary target for Christian zealots. By 400 AD, the theologian John Chrysostom noted that the location of the famous tomb was lost to collective memory. Scholars speculate that the body was either buried beneath rubble, moved to the eastern desert to protect it from civil unrest, or potentially Christianized to ensure its survival. A provocative modern hypothesis proposed by researcher Andrew Chugg suggests that Alexander's remains were never destroyed, but rebranded as those of Saint Mark the Evangelist in 392 AD to save them from the Theodosian purges. According to this theory, Phoenician merchants stole these rebranded remains from Alexandria in 828 AD and smuggled them to Venice, where they are now venerated in St. Mark's Basilica. Supporting this claim is a 3rd century BC fragment of a high-status Macedonian tomb found embedded in the basilica's foundations in 1960. Chugg argues this fragment is an exact match for the tomb casing of the sarcophagus of Nectanebo II, the pharaonic vessel long associated with Alexander's first burial in Egypt. The search for the Holy Grail of archaeology continues today, most notably in Alexandria's Shalalat Gardens. Leading the investigation is Calliope Limnios Papacosta, who in 2009 unearthed a marble sculpture of Alexander at the site, which she believes marks the location of the ancient royal quarters. Beyond his physical remains, Alexander's genetic legacy remains a point of mythic fascination. While the Kalash people of Pakistan have long claimed descent from his soldiers, comprehensive DNA analysis using Y chromosome markers has challenged this narrative, identifying them instead as an extremely isolated ancient northern Eurasian population whose drift predates the Macedonian conquest. Alexander III of Macedon thus remains a figure of both forensic reality and eternal myth, a man who, in death as in life, continues to bridge the gap between historical fact and legendary immortality.